Okay, so this is my second attempt at the third video for chapter 3 of Queer Phenomenology by Sarah Ahmed. Chapter 3, The Orient and Other Others. At the end of the last video, I stopped summarizing it around page 126. So just to briefly recap that, Ahmed is talking about race, inheritance, and how we inherit the reachability of some objects, and some objects are further from us. Race becomes, in this model, a question of what is within reach, what is available to perceive and to do things with. Ahmed also states that if we inherit proximities rather than attributes, then we also inherit who can and cannot be brought home. And this brings us to 127, where Ahmed concretizes her discussion of race and inheritance by grounding it in the example of bringing a lover home, presumably in this example, a lover of a different race. Quote, orientations are reproduced through the very ways in which others are available as objects for love. Or I guess I would add to this, or oneself as the other. The demand is that such love is directed back towards the family by producing offspring that can inherit its form by having a good likeness as a likeness, in other words, that gets read as a family possession. And if you diverge from this, you might become the black sheep or a family deviant. Ahmed says the black sheep and other family deviants could even be considered to offer an alternative line of descent. Indeed, the family deviant gets easily read as a stranger or even a foreigner, whose proximity threatens the family line. A mixed and queer genealogy might even unfold from such points. And we can see that compulsory heterosexuality is the ground for the reproduction of such normative whiteness, right? Because, if the family is interested in reproduction, interested in continuing its genealogical line, and if part of that genealogical line is an investment in whiteness, then the family becomes a straightening device in Ahmed's view, akin to the way that compulsory heterosexuality is one such straightening device in chapter 2. So 128, again, whiteness is framed as a gift that must be returned. It is not that whiteness simply exists as a possession, but that it becomes a possession through this demand to return, which takes the form of a defense against an imagined loss of a future line. Ahmed allows that certain forms of proximity to racial others can reinforce this. Others might then become resources for extending the reach of the white body. That is, they may function as orientation devices. And I keep doing the finger quotes because Ahmed does a lot of scare quotes, or, she uses a lot of quotes to draw attention to things, or italics to draw attention to things. Here Ahmed invokes bell Hook's work on the white body's desire for racial others as eating the other. This incorporation, this desire that becomes incorporation. So becoming and being is also at issue here. Becoming confirms non-being through how it extends the very surface of being toward that which it is not. As an orientation toward others, whiteness gets reproduced even in the moment when it, quote, according to Ahmed, acquires some color. Whiteness can be interpreted as a politics of return, right? And Ahmed is very interested in the political economies of embodied existence and social life. So this takes us to habit spaces, and in particular on 129 to the idea of whiteness as a bad habit. And this idea emphasizes the principle of reinforcement through repetition and shared orientation that extends throughout queer phenomenology, and makes Ahmed, at least in this book, a writer with a lot of affinities to other scholars like Judith Butler, in her Bodies That Matter, or Gender Trouble, in which repetition, iterativity, performativity of gestures, accrues and solidifies and takes on a kind of force. So there's more. Ahmed's goal for this section, I went to explore how public spaces take shape through the habitual action of bodies, such that the contours of space could be described as habitual. So, this is just her tracking her movement here, um, from the family to institutional spaces, like for her, one that's really ready to hand, which is, or was at that time, the university. There's more lexicographical riffing here on habit, inhabit, habitual, and habitation. Um, the repetition of tending toward is what identity coheres around, that is, tendencies. We do not then inherit our tendencies, we acquire our tendencies from what we inherit. So again, this is that concept of towardness and aroundness, or this dynamic in which both of those orientations are in play. And it's actually a system where being oriented towards something focuses us around another thing. But here it's talking about tendencies, habits, habitus, this idea of Bourdieu's, and influenced by Husserl, of sort of what is second nature. 130, bodies also take the shape of what they do, where the do does not simply keep the future open, but also restricts possibilities for action in the present. And right, because if a certain set of practices become habitual, that is almost like a set of things that are proximate. A set of gestures that are habitual is like a set of objects that are proximate. At least that's how I was understanding this passage. So next, Ahmed reflects on Merleau-Ponty's notion of the habitual body, which, simply put, is, for Merleau-Ponty, the habitual body is a body that acts in the world where actions bring other things near. But the habitual body, in its habituality, elides the behind, what's behind it, what undergirds it, which is race. Or race is one of the constitutive factors, and the constitutive factor at issue in this chapter. So 131, it states it plainly: race might be understood as a matter of the behind. Ahmed illustrates this by alluding to Merleau-Ponty's example of like assistive devices, like the blind person's stick and her pen, and objects used to extend the body that are incorporated into one's own body concept. Habits, in other words, do not just involve the repetition of tending toward, but also involve the incorporation of that which is tended toward into the body. And this is relevant because othering can be redescribed as a form of extension, which extends bodily reach through acts of incorporation. Again, this is another take on bell Hooks's eating the other. Right? 132, whiteness becomes habitual in the sense that white bodies extend their reach by incorporating objects that are within reach. Right? And it is hence possible to talk about the whiteness of space, given the very accumulation of such points of extension. Spaces acquire the skin of the bodies that inhabit them. And so there's a transfer here, right, where if enough energy accrues in a space, if enough whiteness accumulates within bodies, creating these points of extension, the space acquires it too, because the space is shaped around the comfort of certain bodies and not others. So in this light, Ahmed suggests that we consider institutions themselves as orientation devices, and that when we describe an institution as being white, we are pointing to how institutional spaces are shaped by the proximity of some bodies and not others. And Ahmed's example for this is a meeting or something like that, where she catches herself noticing 4 Black feminist colleagues arriving, and she notices herself noticing, right? And the fact that it is noticeable means that it's not habitual, um, which points to um, the whiteness of a space, which again for Ahmed, like all the other seeming givens of this of social life, are actually the effect of work. Um, so 133, white bodies are somatic norms that make non-white bodies feel out of place. And there is, the idea of around and toward comes back again. Spaces are oriented around whiteness, which means whiteness is not the what that we are oriented toward. We don't face whiteness; it trails behind, right? Um, because it's work, because it's a violent work. It's relegated. Well, really, because it's habitual, it's relegated, but it's also uh, relegated in its violence, I would think. And so, still in 133, Ahmed brings in Althusser's idea of the hail, right? How subjects become interpolated. And the classic example for this is of a police officer shouting at someone on a street, "Hey, you," and you're not. The process of interpolation is in part through that hail, um, but it also happens in part towards turning to answer that hail. And as soon as you become the "Hey, you've been recruited into a role that already existed, and now you're being cast in it in a sense. So the subject is recruited by turning around. In 134, I thought that Ahmed's observation that by being part of the institution, even when we critique, complain, or oppose it, that we keep it at the center of attention, which aligns us with it and with others who share that enlightenment, was a particularly interesting one. Because and this is just an aside here, I feel like some of the most vociferous critics of the academy are within the academy. And yet, you might say that it's a kind of criticism that doesn't necessarily, I mean, at least for maybe tenure people, it doesn't risk anything. And it also doesn't fundamentally disrupt the centrality of the institution as the thing that is organized around, right? Anyway, I thought it was interesting. So recruitment, again, this idea of turning to answer the hail, being hailed and turning to answer the hail, creates the very ego ideal of the institution. And importantly, organizations tend to recruit in their own image, like the family. Institutions also involve orientation devices that keep things in place. The affect of such placement could be described as a form of comfort, and I think this is the violence that I'm talking about, where the violence of the institution is in the enforcement of white comfort. So this is I think where I'll stop for this third video. The next video I'll move on to page 135 and go from there. So, all right.